My name is. Well, let's just say my name isn't the most important part of this story. What matters is that you're here, sitting with me, and we're going to talk about something a lot of people try to sweep under a very expensive rug. Grab your coffee, get comfortable, and let's just take a breath together. Because if you have ever had to quietly earn your place in your own family, or if you've ever felt like an outsider looking into a house built entirely on appearances, this story is for you. Do me a quick favor. If you already know what it feels like to be tolerated rather than truly loved, just type the word boundaries in the comments right now. It helps me know who is sitting across from me today. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. I know it was a Tuesday because I was sitting at my kitchen table, the rain drumming a slow, rhythmic beat against the glass, while I reviewed a client's corporate balance sheet. It was a normal morning until a sharp, metallic sound broke the silence. The heavy white paper slid through the brass mail slot at exactly 9:14 in the morning. I didn't know it yet, but that exact second was when my old life ended. I can still see the timestamp on the security camera footage I pulled weeks later. 9:14 a.m. Inside that crisp, heavy envelope was a certified letter from the law offices of Whitmore and Crane. It stated in cold, elegant legal prose that I was the named primary beneficiary of the estate of Harold Eugene Calloway, my grandfather. He had died 6 weeks earlier. 6 weeks. And the most heartbreaking part? He passed away at a facility only an hour away and had a beautiful, quiet funeral that I was never told about. I only learned it was over when the paperwork cleared. But it was the number at the bottom of the page that made the room lose its air. $24,500,000. That number. That is the exact price my parents decided was worth more than my existence. Welcome back to the channel where quiet people keep the receipts and families learn the hard way that silence is not the same thing as surrender. If you have ever watched someone smile at your face while moving your name off a legal document, stay with me. Let me tell you exactly what happened when the mask finally slipped. To understand how a family gets to the point of hiding a death to secure a fortune, you have to understand what I do for a living. In this story, my profession wasn't incidental. It was the entire mechanism of justice. I am a forensic accountant and an estate analyst. For over a decade, I have spent my days auditing corporate tax returns, dissecting shell companies, and tracking human greed through paper trails. I read financial documents the way other people read human faces. When a family sits across a conference table trying to figure out how to shield their assets from the people they claim to love, I can spot the cracks before they even open their mouths. I know exactly how a will is put together. I know what it actually means when a clause is worded just a bit too vaguely. And I know with clinical, mathematical precision the exact ways a family can attempt to contest, circumvent, or quietly erase someone from a lineage. My grandfather Harold built his fortune the old-fashioned way. He spent 40 years in commercial real estate across the mid-Atlantic. He was a man who belonged to an era where you shook hands on a deal, looked a person in the eye, and then went home to read the contract twice anyway before ever putting pen to paper. He wasn't a warm man in the way people look warm in old, filtered photographs. He didn't give big, dramatic hugs or give loud speeches. He was warm in the way a person who simply shows up is warm. He was the only one who sat in the front row at my college graduation. He didn't send texts on my birthday. He sent physical cards with handwritten notes that were always exactly 3 sentences long, written in a heavy, deliberate cursive. When he asked you how your week was, he didn't do it to be polite. He sat there, locked his eyes onto yours, and actually waited for the answer. And out of all his children and grandchildren, I was the only one who regularly called him back without needing a reason or a favor. My parents, and my mother in particular, had a very different strategy for managing Harold. They practiced what I like to call performative caretaking. They were incredibly attentive, but only during the specific years his physical health began to visibly decline, and only in ways that could be witnessed by an audience. When Harold finally made the difficult decision to move out of his lifelong home and into a luxury senior living facility back in 2019, my mother completely took over. She coordinated the movers, she personally selected the costliest corner suite, and she immediately installed herself as the primary emergency contact in the facility's administrative database. My father drove the moving truck, sweating heavily and making sure everyone saw how hard he was working. They took dozens of photographs of themselves, helping him unpack his heavy coats. By that evening, those photos were already on my mother's Facebook page with captions like, "Family first, always," and "Taking care of the ones who took care of us." Blessed. But social media doesn't record the quiet moments. Harold called me the very next week. Late at night when the facility was quiet. His voice sounded smaller than usual on the phone. He told me the room was perfectly clean and the staff was polite, but that the entire place smelled like someone else's life. It broke my heart. The very next morning, I drove 3 hours down the highway just to bring him his old, heavy wooden chessboard and the vintage brass desk lamp from his former study. We sat by his window and played 2 complete games. He won both, a faint, sharp smile returning to his face. Before I left, he asked me not to mention to my mother that I had visited. I agreed without asking why. That was the unspoken arithmetic our family ran on for years. My parents performed their duty in public for the sake of their reputation, while I provided actual companionship in private, away from any cameras. Harold watched both sides unfold with his quiet, unblinking attention. And he said absolutely nothing to anyone. I didn't realize back then what he was calculating. Have you ever been the person in your family who does all the heavy lifting behind the scenes while someone else steps up to take the credit on social media? If you know that specific exhaustion, type the word "seen" in the comments. Let's move to what happened next, because this is where the silence turned into a trap. My grandfather passed away on a quiet Sunday morning in March of last year. He was 81 years old. But, as you already know, I didn't get a phone call from my mother that morning. I didn't get a frantic text from my father. I didn't get to drive down that familiar highway one last time to say goodbye. Instead, I learned about his death 3 days later on a chilly Wednesday evening from a completely unexpected source. I was sitting at my office desk, finishing up some late-night paperwork when my phone buzzed. It was a text from a woman named Martha, an elderly neighbor who lived next door to my grandfather's old house before he moved into the facility. She had seen his obituary in the local county newspaper and assumed I was grieving with the rest of the family. She texted me to offer her condolences and to ask if I needed anything. I remember staring at her text message for what felt like an eternity, the words blurring together as the room grew completely cold around me. I want to be very precise about what I did and did not do in that exact moment. I did not panic. I did not burst into tears, and I absolutely did not call my parents to demand an explanation. Instead, my professional instincts as an auditor kicked in to protect me from the emotional shatter. I opened my laptop, went to the newspaper's digital archive, and pulled up the obituary. There it was, time-stamped at 6:47 p.m. on a Wednesday evening. I read through the text carefully. The obituary listed his survivors. My mother's name was there, spelled out perfectly. My father's name followed. Even my younger brother, who hadn't visited Harold in over 18 months, was mentioned as a grieving grandson. My name was nowhere to be found. It was completely, deliberately omitted. I printed that web page out. I watched the black ink bleed onto the white paper, a physical proof of my family's betrayal. I put that paper inside a brand new manila folder. The funeral, according to the text, had already taken place the previous Saturday. While I had been sitting at home thinking my grandfather was sleeping peacefully in his care home, my parents had been holding a formal service. For days leading up to that Saturday, there had been an elaborate reception. There had been massive, expensive floral arrangements, paid for out of Harold's accounts. There had been, as I later learned from a heartbreaking conversation with Martha, a formal, cream-colored guest book with a delicate blue silk ribbon. That guest book had been brought to the service by Dolores, Harold's faithful housekeeper, of 15 years, because she believed it was the honorable thing to do for a man who had treated her with respect. But my signature wasn't in that book. My presence wasn't in that room. And it wasn't because I chose to stay away. It was because my own parents had built an informational wall around his passing, ensuring that the one person who truly loved the man behind the money would be completely left in the dark. I sat very still at my desk for a very long time after putting those first documents away. My hands were perfectly flat against the polished wood of my desk. I remember staring at my fingers, noticing how steady they were despite the roaring emptiness in my chest. I didn't rage. I didn't break anything. I just took a deep, steadying breath, closed the folder, and labeled the front tab with my grandfather's full name and the date of his passing. I set it right in the center of my desk where I could see it every single day. Isn't it strange how the people who share your blood can look at your grief and see it merely as an inconvenience to be managed? Have you ever had a moment where you realized you had to mourn someone while simultaneously realizing that the living people around you were actively plotting against your peace? If you've ever had to hold your breath and stay steady while your heart was breaking, type the word steady in the comments. Because right here is where the story shifts from a tragedy into a calculated legal chess game. The official certified letter from the law offices of Whitmore and Crane arrived exactly 6 weeks after that silent Wednesday discovery. As soon as I finished reading the notice at my kitchen table, I dialed the number listed on the letterhead. My voice remained perfectly flat, devoid of any emotional tremor. A junior associate answered, verified my legal identity through a series of standard security questions, and then immediately transferred me to a scheduler. She informed me that the senior partner, Daniel Whitmore, wanted to meet with me in person at my earliest convenience to formally discuss the estate of Harold Eugene Calloway. I didn't hesitate. I simply looked at my calendar and said, "Thursday morning works for me. Thank you." I drove to that meeting on a crisp Thursday morning in May. I wore my sharpest charcoal gray suit, the exact one I wear to high-stakes corporate closings when I need to command a room. I brought a fresh leather notepad and a sleek black pen. I did not bring my own manila folder. Not yet. I wanted to see exactly what they had prepared for me first. Daniel Whitmore was a man in his late 60s, possessing the kind of absolute stillness that only comes from spending 40 years navigating wealthy family feuds inside wood-paneled conference rooms. When I walked in, I recognized the look in his eyes immediately. It was a calculated professional courtesy, an expression usually extended to someone he expected to find emotionally devastated or utterly overwhelmed by sudden wealth. He had a large cardboard banker's box sitting on the corner of his polished mahogany desk. Right next to it lay a thick, leather-bound will flagged with dozens of neon, color-coded tabs, alongside a formal trust instrument that was exactly 47 pages long. As it turned out, Harold had quietly retained the services of Whitmore and Crane back in 2018, a full 3 years before my parents ever moved him into that senior living facility. He had drafted his initial will and established his primary trust with them in secret. But the real shift occurred in 2021. Harold had executed a formal amendment to both documents, and the paperwork was dated exactly April 4th, 2021. I have that date permanently memorized. April 4th, 2021 was exactly 11 days after my mother had successfully installed herself as Harold's primary emergency contact at the care home. It was exactly 11 days after she had uploaded those performative family photographs to her Facebook page. While my parents were busy celebrating their public victory, Harold had quietly arranged for a private car to take him directly to Daniel Whitmore's office to completely rewrite his legacy. According to the revised trust instrument, I was named the 100% primary beneficiary of all his liquid financial assets and active investment portfolios, which totaled an incredible $17.2 million. His commercial real estate portfolio, appraised at an additional $4.1 million, was also transferred entirely to me through a separate legal instrument. There was only one specific carve-out, a beautiful parcel of land in Virginia that Harold had held since 1987. He left that property entirely to Dolores, his loyal housekeeper. The will stated in Harold's own precise words, "She showed up when it mattered, and she asked for nothing." My parents were technically listed in the documents, but only to prevent them from claiming they had been accidentally forgotten. Harold left them exactly $25,000 each, accompanied by a sealed manila envelope. Daniel Whitmore slid the banker's box across the table toward me. Inside was that envelope, a heavy wooden chess piece, the Black Queen, from the vintage set I had brought to his facility room, and a framed photograph of the two of us smiling at my law school graduation. On the dusty back of that photograph, Harold had written a single line in his heavy cursive. "She reads the fine print. Always has." I turned the photograph face down on the table, keeping my hands completely steady. I did not open the personal note yet. Instead, I looked directly at Daniel and asked him to start from the very beginning and lay out the entire history of the file. What he told me next made my blood run cold, but it confirmed everything I had ever suspected about the people who raised me. Daniel Whitmore leaned back in his leather chair, crossed his hands, and delivered the details with a clinical calm that matched my own. He explained that my parents had contacted the senior living facility back in February of 2021. They hadn't done it to check on his comfort or to upgrade his dining plan. They had formally requested and initiated a process to have Harold's decision-making capacity legally assessed by a medical board, explicitly citing their deep concerns about his rapid cognitive decline. It was a cold, calculated, preemptive strike. But the independent medical assessment backfired completely. The physicians found Harold entirely competent, sharp, and fully aware of his surroundings. Undeterred by the medical report, my parents then attempted to schedule an urgent meeting with Harold's long-term estate attorney. Not Daniel, but an older lawyer who had handled his basic property deeds for years, intending to pressure him into updating Harold's documents while he was isolated in the facility. Harold, however, had spent a lifetime reading the small print on real estate acquisitions. He watched this entire corporate-style takeover unfold with his trademark quiet attention. Instead of engaging in a screaming match with his own children, he quietly picked up his phone, bypassed his old representation entirely, and transferred his entire legal portfolio over to Daniel Whitmore. But Harold didn't just change his lawyer. He laid down a meticulous digital paper trail. He explicitly instructed Daniel to document the exact timeline of every single contact attempt from my parents, every unauthorized financial inquiry they made, and every aggressive demand sent through the facility's front administration desk. Daniel then pointed to the heavy box on his desk. It wasn't just a will inside. It was a 4-inch thick legal binder filled with logged emails, recorded phone messages, and formal cease and desist warnings that Daniel had quietly issued to my parents on Harold's behalf over a 3-year period. I sat in that quiet office until late in the afternoon, meticulously turning every single one of those 47 trust pages. I read the amendment line by line. I cataloged the exact dates in the 4-inch file. The true revelation, however, came on page 31 of that binder. It was a personal, typewritten letter that Harold had drafted himself, signed, and formally notarized. It described in plain, unembellished language exactly what he believed was happening, what he had observed from his armchair, and precisely why he had stripped his own children of their expected inheritance. He wrote it the way he played his opening moves in chess. No wasted prose, no emotional fluff, just absolute tactical finality. The letter concluded with a devastating, brilliant sentence that I will share with you in just a moment. I drove home that evening in absolute silence. I didn't play the radio. I didn't call a friend to vent. I simply created a brand new corporate-grade legal folder, organized every piece of evidence by date, and reviewed the entire timeline from start to finish. While my dinner grew cold on the counter, I put on a classical record, sat in my favorite armchair, and waited. I knew exactly how their minds worked, and I knew a storm was coming. Sure enough, exactly 2 weeks after my confidential meeting with Daniel Whitmore, my mother called me on a Saturday morning. Her voice possessed that overly sweetened, carefully modulated tone she always uses when she is delivering massive news that she expects will require heavy interpersonal management. She told me, in a voice that sounded almost maternal and gentle, that they had been working closely with the county probate court and that things were turning out to be a little complicated with Grandpa Harold's remaining estate. She said they wanted to host a formal family dinner at their house. She said there was simply a lot of paperwork to sort through, and it would be much better for everyone if we did it together as a unified family. I took a slow sip of my tea, looked at the black chess queen sitting on my counter, and calmly replied that a family dinner sounded perfectly fine. I asked her what time she wanted me to arrive. Isn't it fascinating how the people who actively kept your name off a funeral guest list will suddenly remember you exist the moment they realize there are legal forms that require your participation? If you've ever seen a toxic person suddenly turn on the charm when they need something from you, type the word mask in the comments right now. Because the dinner party they were planning wasn't an invitation. It was an ambush. When I arrived at my parents' house for that dinner, the atmosphere was thick with an artificial, performing warmth. My father sat heavily at the head of the dining table, carving the roast and speaking about Harold's vast estate with the grand authority of a man who believed he was already the default executor of a massive empire. He used the exact phrase, "what Harold would have wanted," at least 4 distinct times before the salad plates were even cleared. My mother chimed in constantly, talking wistfully about keeping the old family home in our lineage, which was a bizarre, psychological performance because Harold had actually sold that specific property back in 2015, meaning it simply did not exist. My younger brother, who had flown all the way in from Charlotte just for this meal, spent the evening talking loudly about his aggressive new investment strategies for the upcoming market portfolio. The fascinating part about the entire dinner was the sheer ignorance in the room. None of them had actually seen the physical will yet. None of them had been granted access to the formal trust documents. They were building an entire financial empire inside their minds based purely on a toxic assumption that blood relation guaranteed absolute compliance. I listened quietly. I ate my food deliberately. I asked zero questions. After the meal concluded, my mother walked me out to my car in the driveway, wrapping her arms around her sweater and adopting the careful, measured warmth of someone selecting their words with extreme legal caution. She told me she hoped I truly understood how much physical and emotional support Harold had required in his final years, and that the family, meaning explicitly herself and my father, had carried that entire burden alone. Then she looked at me with a sharp, warning glare and said she hoped I wasn't going to choose to be difficult during the upcoming probate process. I looked at her face under the dim driveway light for a long, unblinking moment. I asked her a single question: who exactly called the senior facility back in February of 2021 to have his mental competency formally assessed? Her face went entirely pale, and she stammered, claiming she had absolutely no idea what I was talking about. I simply smiled, said good night, and got into my car. I sat in their dark driveway for exactly 3 minutes, pulled out my phone, and left a direct message for Daniel Whitmore to officially begin the formal notification process. I told him to send the certified letters out the very next morning. Exactly 3 weeks after those legal notices hit their mailbox, my parents hastily called a formal family meeting. This wasn't a casual Sunday dinner. This was a high-stakes tribunal arranged in the living room of their home. They had brought in reinforcements. My brother was present, looking deeply uncomfortable. Alongside my mother's older sister, my Aunt Renata, who had flown all the way in from Florida. Right next to her sat her husband Gerald, a man who consistently held incredibly loud opinions about topics he fundamentally did not understand, paired with the unearned confidence to voice them at maximum volume. My mother had carefully arranged the living room chairs in a tight, closed circle, which I recognized as a deliberate psychological choice designed to make me feel isolated and trapped. She opened the meeting by stating that the family needed to present an absolute unified position to the state court. My father chimed in right on cue, grumbling about how the mounting legal costs of a prolonged estate dispute would be terrible for everyone involved. Gerald kept repeating the word contested over and over again, rolling it around in his mouth like a legal phrase he had just memorized on the drive over. My brother, to his absolute credit, remained completely quiet, staring intensely at his phone and refusing to look up at the rest of the room. Then my mother's tone shifted from artificial warmth into something much harder, colder, and direct. She looked across the circle, locked her eyes directly onto mine, and explained that Harold's final estate documents had clearly been structured under a massive amount of undue influence. She used that exact legally operative phrase, undue influence, and stated that they fully intended to demonstrate in a court of law that I had maliciously manipulated an elderly, vulnerable man who was suffering from severe, documented cognitive decline. The entire room went dead silent, holding its collective breath, waiting for me to shatter, cry, or begin screaming in self-defense. But they forgot one thing. I don't scream. I look at the fine print. I leaned forward slightly in my chair, keeping my posture relaxed and my breathing perfectly measured. The silence in the room stretched out, heavy and suffocating. But I let it hang there until the nervous shifting of my uncle's feet broke the quiet. I looked directly at my mother and asked, "May I have the floor for a moment?" She crossed her arms, leaning back with a smug, dismissive gesture, as if she were granting a small child a generous favor. I quietly unzipped my leather folder, pulled out the first document, and placed Daniel Whitmore's official engagement letter flat on the glass coffee table between us. I said, Harold retained independent specialized legal counsel back in 2018, a full 3 years before any of the timeline you are currently fabricating. Next, I pulled out the formal trust revision and placed it right beside the letter. He amended his estate documents on April 4, 2021. That was exactly 11 days after you forced the administration to list you as his emergency contact, and 11 days after you took those performative caretaking photos for your Facebook profile. He watched you build your strategy, and he built his defense. My mother opened her mouth to interrupt, her face flushed with rising anger, but I didn't give her the space to speak. I took out the third document, the official medical competency assessment. I slid it across the glass until it rested directly under her hands. This is the independent mental evaluation you commissioned behind his back in February of 2021. I want you to read the letterhead very carefully. You ordered this document hoping it would give you the power of attorney. Instead, the medical board found Harold entirely competent, sharp, and possessing full legal capacity. You provided the single most bulletproof piece of evidence to validate his intent, and it bears your own signature. Uncle Gerald cleared his throat loudly, trying to salvage the situation by blustering about how clever lawyers can easily manipulate an elderly man's emotions. In response, I didn't say a word. I simply reached into my folder, lifted the massive 4-inch thick binder of logged contact attempts, aggressive phone transcripts, and unauthorized financial inquiries, and dropped it heavily onto the center of the coffee table. The loud, solid thud echoed through the living room. I let the sheer, undeniable physical volume of their own documented harassment sit there in front of them. My mother's voice cracked as it went up an octave. She stood up, shouting that favoritism was not the same thing as legal intent, and that a probate judge would easily see through my cold-blooded manipulation. My father stood up right alongside her, his face turning an angry, deep shade of crimson. He used a vicious, derogatory word he had never dared to use with me in my entire life. I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. I pulled out my notepad, looked at my watch, and calmly wrote down the exact word with a precise timestamp. Then, looking up directly into his eyes, I said very softly, "Sit down, please." The sheer freezing coldness in my voice caught him completely off guard. He hesitated for a second, looked around the quiet room, and sank back into his chair. Finally, I took a single notarized page out of the very back of my folder. This is a personal letter written by Harold himself, signed in front of a public notary. I'm going to read you one specific line from page 31. I smoothed the paper down and read his exact words into the quiet room. I have watched my daughter-in-law manage my care the way a person manages a commercial property they intend to flip for a profit. Not with an ounce of love, but with a calculated plan. I am not confused about the difference. The room went completely, devastatingly dead silent. Aunt Renata slowly put both of her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. I placed that final devastating page right on top of the massive stack of documents. I turned my head and looked at my younger brother. He was staring straight down at the hardwood floor, completely refusing to meet my eyes. Without lifting his head, his voice came out flat, hollow, and entirely honest. He said, "I didn't know about the funeral. They told me you refused to answer their calls." I noted his words in my mind, recognizing the genuine weight of his confession. I reached into my blazer pocket, pulled out the heavy black wooden chess queen that Harold had left for me in his banker's box, and set it directly on top of the notarized letter on the coffee table. I looked around the circle one last time, buttoned my coat, and picked up my leather folder. "He always played black," I told them quietly. He said black had to be infinitely smarter, because black always goes second. I'll see you both in probate court. I turned my back on them and walked out into the rain. The formal contest was filed by their high-priced attorneys 3 weeks later, just as expected. And just as quickly, it was completely dismissed. The probate court took one look at the flawless timeline, the medical competency assessment commissioned by my own parents, the 4-inch binder of documented harassment that Daniel Whitmore had meticulously built, and that devastating notarized letter. The judge threw out the case, without even granting a single formal hearing. There were exactly 12 words in the final dismissal order that settled my grandfather's legacy forever. Testator's capacity and intent are not subject to any reasonable dispute. With that stroke of a pen, the trust dispersed in full. The $17.2 million, minus standard estate taxes and legal fees, transferred smoothly into my accounts. The commercial property portfolio was legally retitled under my name. The beautiful Virginia parcel went entirely to Dolores, Harold's faithful housekeeper. When she called me after the deed cleared, hearing her cry on the phone was the only time in this entire grueling process that I had to put my hand over my mouth for a moment just to catch my breath before I could speak back to her. My parents received exactly $25,000 each, alongside their sealed envelopes. I never asked what Harold wrote in those final notes. That was a private reckoning between their consciences and a man they tried to treat like a financial transaction. They attempted to file a second, desperate challenge 6 months later through a different law firm, but the court threw it out in just 48 days. My brother called me about 8 weeks after that explosive living room meeting. He didn't make excuses, and he didn't use qualifiers. He sat on the phone and told me he had known about the general intent to manage the estate situation and that he had gone along with it simply by staying quiet and looking the other way. He said he was truly sorry. I told him I appreciated the honesty and that I heard him, but that I wasn't ready to have a longer relationship with him just yet. I left it there. Aunt Renata and Uncle Gerald never called me again, which was perhaps the greatest hidden inheritance of all. Today, that heavy black wooden chess queen sits right on my corporate desk at work, positioned perfectly between my computer monitor and my desk lamp. I look at it whenever a difficult client sits across from me, trying to explain away why a contract doesn't mean what it clearly and legally says. It is a very useful thing to look at in those moments. I didn't keep the wealth for myself to live in luxury. I used the money to build things that matter. I established a full, permanent scholarship in my grandfather's name at his old university. The Harold E. Callaway Scholarship in Business and Ethics, awarded annually to a first-generation student who has to fight for their place in the world. The first recipient was named last spring. I sent Dolores a photograph of the proud young student holding the announcement. A week later, she sent me a physical card in the mail. It was written in a familiar, heavy cursive, and it contained exactly 3 sentences. I also donated a significant portion of the funds to the legal clinic at my former law school, the one that provides free, high-quality estate planning services to low-income elderly clients. Because if Harold's situation taught me anything at all, it's that a vulnerable person without an independent lawyer stands absolutely no chance when they meet a greedy family with a calculated plan. I want to leave you with one final thought today because I know some of you are quietly going through your own family battles right now. I did not fight my parents because I was consumed by anger. Anger is a messy, volatile emotion that clouds your judgment and causes you to make mistakes. I fought because an old man I loved spent 11 careful years building a beautiful, ironclad legal structure that explicitly said, "I see exactly what is happening around me, and I am choosing something different." He trusted that the structure would hold, and he trusted that there would be someone standing on the other end of it who knew exactly how to hold it with him. Calm is not compliance. Silence is not surrender. My family confused those concepts my entire life. They mistook my quiet nature for weakness, and they assumed that, because I didn't participate in their loud public performances of care, I simply didn't care at all. They saw someone who didn't raise their voice and assumed they had found someone who would never act. But Harold never made that mistake. He read the fine print. He knew I read it too. What they tried to take from me wasn't just the $24.5 million. The money was just the mechanism. What they tried to erase was the final, clear, legally binding statement of an 81-year-old man who had been watching, weighing, and deciding his entire life. A man who looked at the world and said deliberately, legally with witnesses, "This one. This is the one who showed up." I was never going to let that statement be washed away by their greed, their psychological pressure, or a dinner table full of people who decided a funeral guest book didn't need my name in it. The document said what it said, and I made sure it was heard exactly where it mattered. Me. If this story reminded you today that the person who never makes a scene is often the last person you should ever underestimate, I want you to keep that close to your heart. And if it reminded you that showing up quietly, consistently, and genuinely for the people you love is a thing that gets noticed even when the rest of the world is busy performing for an audience, keep that even closer. Harold kept his receipts. He just chose to call them a last will and testament. If you want to hear more stories about quiet people, deep boundaries, and the documents they leave behind, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below. I read every single one of them. And if you know someone in your life right now who needs to be reminded that remaining calm is a brilliant strategy, not a surrender, please send this video to them today. Take care of yourselves, set your boundaries, and I will see you in the next story.